we've talked about before. But I am joined by a couple of experts. Of course, 9 Health expert Dr. Pal Coley is joining us. She's a cardiologist, but also an expert on preventive medicine and internal medicine. I also have Wendy Fisher, who's a registered dietitian with a master's in public health at the Arkansas Valley Regional Medical Center. We're doing these online assessments. One of them is for nutrition, and I'll put a link to it in the comments. We originally launched these in the lower Arkansas Valley in the southeast Colorado, so it's really nice to have an expert joining us from that area. So let's get right into it. First, Dr. Coley, can you just talk in general about nutrition and COVID-19, how they're related and how our food choices affect our immunity and just protect us right now?
Yeah, during COVID-19, one of the biggest questions that's come up is what people can do to protect themselves. And good nutrition is one of those things that's really important in terms of reducing your chance of infection. So we know that nutrition is a key player in the immune system. And we know that many different vitamins and micronutrients, specifically vitamin A, B, C, D, and E, and other micronutrients are involved in immune function. Studies from literature have also told us that deficiencies of these vitamins can actually reduce your body's ability to fight infections, particularly respiratory infections, and increase potential susceptibility to pneumonias and presumably to COVID-19 as well. So one of the most important things we can do during this pandemic is to really, first of all, identify whether we're eating a good, well-balanced diet or not. And then secondly, try to identify ways in which we can improve our diet to not only reduce our risk of COVID-19, but also other downstream complications, things like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, heart disease, all of those things that are also linked to worse outcomes in COVID-19. So by improving your diet, you can actually help your risk of COVID-19 in two ways. One is that you can, improve your immune function if you have a vitamin deficiency and reduce your risk of catching the infection. And then the second is if you do catch the infection, but you have a healthy diet, by maintaining a healthy weight, avoiding diabetes, hypertension, those types of diseases, you can actually probably also lower your risk of complications from the infection. So nutrition now more than ever, I think, is incredibly important, and it's something that we really have to think about. And during this time, a lot of us have gained weight. A lot of the data has shown us that the average weight gain amongst Americans has been about 5 pounds or so during the pandemic. So we really have to work on watching that as well.
Yeah, 5 pounds isn't too bad. We keep talking about the COVID-15 or the COVID-19 and gaining a bunch of weight right now, but 5 pounds isn't too bad. But yeah, we probably all could be eating better. So Wendy, can you give us some ideas for healthy eating, some foods we should all have or maybe not have in our homes right now?
The key is to reduce inflammation. So you don't want to eat foods that would increase that. And those are the foods I think we all know aren't healthy. Fried foods, lots of sweets, especially sodas and sugary drinks that really don't offer any nutrition at all. And any kind of red meat can tend to increase inflammation. Lots of carbs are not good for you, but we all kind of know that. I think we just need to review it and emphasize that you've got to keep your immune system strong, and that's one way to help it. Foods you want to include are things like fruits and vegetables. There's a lot of good vegetables out there now. A lot of crops are coming into season right now in Colorado and other areas also. So we want to increase our intake of those foods to try to keep us healthy. And maybe it's a good time to just get healthy overall. A lot of people are telling me that maybe this is going to be a life-changing thing for them. Maybe they hadn't been doing so well before, and this is kind of a wake-up call. So hopefully that's the case, and we can all start eating better and living healthier.
Yeah, and I think there's, for a lot of us maybe experiencing more stress right now with the uncertainty of the pandemic, there's comfort and comfort foods like carbs and things too, right? So can you maybe you talked a little bit about this, and it's things we know, but specifically some foods to just keep out of our house. You mentioned red meat, some carbs. Are there some carbs that can be comforting and still good for us? I know like a whole grain piece of toast might still be kind of comforting.
Correct.
Whole grain.
There are healthy carbs and carbs that aren't so healthy. Of course, whole grain breads and cereals, any kind of fresh fruit and vegetable are healthy carbs. Any kind of like a whole grain rice, like a brown rice versus a white rice would be better for you. Anything that's higher in fiber is going to be less inflammatory for your body. So you want to include as many of those as you can. I know since I'm home more, the food is more readily available. And we tend to crave things, I think, when we're under stress that maybe aren't so good for us. Now, maybe we need to think of before we eat. It's easy to eat 8 snacks a day, and you think, okay, I'll have a little bit of this, but that all adds up after a while.
Yeah, also just about, knowing how many calories you need for the day as well, and whether or not you're going to exercise or get some activity.
Correct.
Dr.
Correct.
Can you talk about food as medicine as well? You touched on this a little bit, but helping to reverse or prevent, or even reduce our risk for some of these chronic conditions using our nutrition.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I'm a strong believer in the fact that food should be your first and best medicine, actually. And a poor diet can, be your worst enemy, and a good diet can be your best friend. So we really need to think about, if we're starting to head down the path of developing chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, or any of those that are potentially reversible by our dietary habits, how we can use food as medicine, how we can change our diet, alter our not just the amount that we're eating, but the content of what we're eating in order to reverse many of those processes. And the nice thing is that early on in the course of many of those illnesses, whether it's hypertension and salt intake, or your diabetes and your sugar intake, you really can reverse many of those processes. But if you let it go on too long, you don't alter your diet, you don't make those changes, then it becomes more difficult to treat with lifestyle alone, and then you have to reach for those medications. But 9 out of 10 Americans eat too much salt in their diet. And that is an easy intervention if you spend 1 or 2 days just counting the salt. So the first part of that is, I call it the ABCs. A stands for awareness, is actually evaluating what you're doing. And the way to do that is to add up how much salt you're eating. And then the B and C stands for behavioral change. And then the second part is to institute that behavioral change so that you can really, change what you're taking in, and that'll change the trajectory of the disease. And that's one of the reasons I strongly encourage you to go to 9healthfair.org and fill out the assessment, because that A is really important. Really trying to understand exactly what is lacking in your diet is the first step in terms of making the right changes so that you can use food as medicine and you don't have to go to the pharmacy and get other medicines.
Yeah, and again, I put the link to our online assessment in the comments. I'm trying to get us back here. So you can go ahead and take that. It's just yes, no questions. And if you answer, I think 3 of the questions, if you answer no, that you should, follow up with a healthcare provider, see a dietitian like Wendy, and just kind of assess your lifestyle and what improvements you can make to live your healthiest life. Wendy, I wanted to talk a little bit about food labels, because sometimes food labels can be a little hard to read, and we might think we're eating something healthy when we're really not. So maybe just talk about some misunderstandings that people have about food labels and tips and things to look for when you're picking out foods.
Food labels can be very difficult to read, especially if somebody's counting carbs, a diabetic, because they have total carbs, and sometimes they have total carb servings. But you have to look at the serving size. You may think the whole package is a serving size when actually there's 3 servings in there. And so you think it's a low-calorie food, but it's really not a low-calorie food. Look at the ingredient list. The first ingredient in the food is the most abundant in that food. So even though it might be low in calories, you still got to check and make sure it's high in nutrients. That's important too. So look at those foods and take some time to look at the food label, because it can be very, very misleading. Every food should have a label on it that has any nutrition claims, or even if it doesn't. Of course, obviously, fresh fruits and vegetables do not, but any kind of packaged prepared food should have a food label on it. And what you need varies on you. A 6'4" man's going to need a lot more calories than a 5'1" woman is. So you have to take that into consideration too. Your activity level and your lifestyle. But now is a time to eat better and maintain that and keep that after this virus is gone.
And I would just add to that most of the food labels are really based on a 2,000 calorie diet, which, to Wendy's point, right, if you're a petite woman, those percentages may not apply to you because your caloric intake for one day is probably a bit lower. So just keep that in mind as well, and to not necessarily only look at the percentage, but also look at the actual numbers themselves, and to try to get a sense of, how many calories you should be taking, and for you, what that sodium content or the saturated fat content or the calories or whatever comprise for your caloric intake.
Yeah, and then either of you could answer this, but is there an easy way to calculate what you need for a day? You know, if you're not in that 2,000 calorie whatever range.
Range.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there is a formula you can plug in your height and your weight and etc. But figure out your BMI, figure out that first to see if you're overweight. And the way you figure that out is you take your weight divided by your height times 703. And that'll give you your BMI. And if you're over 30, you're considered obese. You want me to repeat that? You got that?
I think it's good, and people can always rewatch it if they need that as well. So you calculate your BMI, and then you're able to get how many calories you need per day based on your weight as well.
Well, that tells you if you're overweight or underweight. Then your calories per day can be 25 to 30 calories per kilogram. Figure out your kilograms, take your pounds and divide it by 2.2. But again, that varies because you're going to have big people that need more calories per kilogram. But that might give you a generalized idea. For most women, it's, not more than 1,800. Depends on if you need to lose weight. And for most guys, it's going to be probably 2,200. It depends your activity level and your size.
So I agree with what Wendy said. I would just add to that is that you first need to figure out, you want to maintain your weight, gain weight, or lose weight. So if you're underweight, you probably need to increase your caloric intake. If you're the correct weight, you want to maintain it. And if you're overweight, you want to try to lose it. And then once you've decided based on your BMI, which of those 3 categories you fall into, you can then use calculators to try to get an estimated sense of how many calories you would need to take in to maintain your weight. And now remember, to maintain your weight, it's what you put in and what you take out. So if you're somebody who exercises for 4 hours a day, your caloric intake, even as a small woman, might be higher. On the other hand, if you're a big man who is very sedentary and doesn't exercise, and maybe is a little bit older, so their resting metabolism is also slower, your caloric intake might be lower. So many different factors to consider, whether you want to maintain your weight or not, what your exercise expenditure or caloric expenditure is every day, what your resting metabolism is, which is largely a function of your age, but can also be impacted by things like your thyroid status, for example, whether or not you have an underactive or overactive thyroid. And based on all of those, you can kind of come up with what your range should be. But as Wendy said, for women, it's usually about the 1,200 to 1,500 or so. And then for men, it's a little bit closer to 2,000, but it's highly variable from individual to individual. I have athletes, for example, who come to see me who have a caloric intake of about 3,000 or 3,500 calories a day because of the amount that they exercise.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of apps too that people use, to track the foods they're eating, and those kind of things help as well. And you can kind of decide or figure out how many calories you need to eat per day. But Dr. Clay, I wanted to follow up on food labels with you. It's probably best, someone commented, grow a garden, eat that. Again, it is probably best for us to eat a lot of foods that don't have food labels, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. But just speaking about food labels, can you talk about some hidden sources of saturated fats or trans fats? I know in your tips for things that we should be eating, it's to limit those trans fats and saturated fats. And I think there's some oils and things that processed foods contain that are really hidden sources of that, if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so saturated fats should really compose less than 5% of our caloric intake, again, once you've calculated those calories. And they're comprised of mostly things like animal products. So red meat, as Wendy had said, cheese, dairy, a lot of those have a lot of saturated fats. So keep that in mind and keep it limited to less than 5% of your total caloric intake. And then trans fats are fats that are really bad for you because they do 2 bad things. They lower your good cholesterol and they raise your bad cholesterol. So they're almost like having a double whammy. And a lot of trans fats are used in a lot of products to prolong their shelf life. And so certain types of oils, margarines, butters, those are all the trans fats that we talk about. And that's why we tend to want to avoid processed foods, because there are a lot of hidden sources of trans fat that are on the shelf out there, particularly in those processed foods or foods that come in bags, I like to say, as opposed to foods, like you said, that you can grow in your garden. So you really want to minimize those because those are especially bad for you. I want to just take a minute to talk about what you said in terms of growing garden, because I think the more colors you have on your plate, the more likely you are to enrich your diet with more fruits and vegetables and vitamins. So I try to have as many colors on the plate as possible. And that even includes, not just the fruits and vegetables, but even things like red quinoa or multicolored rice, things that can really add many different sources of vitamins and nutrients to your plate. So keep all that in mind when you're shopping, and read that label like we talked about, because until you get the hang of what has what, it is a little bit challenging to know the hidden sources of saturated fat and trans fats in our diet.
And
yeah, go ahead, Wendy.
And since we're all trying to limit our grocery store visits, let's plan ahead a little bit. Get to know where the good foods are in the grocery store. Make a list if you're that organized. And maybe that will help you get the right foods in your house. Don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry. If I do, I buy stuff I don't really need.
Yeah, I find that I like to do the online ordering anyway, but when I do that, I don't get anything else. I just get all my favorite things that I usually get, and there's no splurges on anything on end caps or different things you see in the store, that kind of thing too. I think that helps too. I wanted to follow up too. Dr. Coley talked about salt. Wendy, I'm probably a salt addict. I think I add salt to too many things. But it's easy to know if there's salt in a food that does have a food label. But Wendy, can you talk a little bit about just adding salt to your food? Is there a portion amount you can measure out? Should you not use it at all? I mean, that's probably the best choice. But maybe just talk about adding salt to foods.
Our food supply is so high in sodium, we don't need to add any salt. Anything that's processed, anything that's canned, is going to be high in sodium. There's foods that are just not processed are lower in sodium. So that's kind of a rule of thumb. You want to try to stick to about 2,500 milligrams per day. But that's pretty hard. It's a hard diet to follow because it's everywhere. To eat out at fast food, that's a lot of salt in that. And some people are more sodium sensitive than others. If you have high blood pressure, if you've got fluid retention, it's even more important to watch your salt. But when you're in the grocery store, shop the perimeter. That's where the healthy foods are. The dairy and the vegetables, and the ones in the middle tend to be more processed foods.
And Wendy is very generous, but I'm a little bit more of a salt Nazi, as I tell Stephanie, because I say you want to stay below 2,000 and even try to get below 1,500 milligrams, because it's just a continuum of risk. And we're so, like Wendy said, everything in our diet has salt, whether it's breads, whether it's drinks, whether it's foods, so I try to push people as far on that end of the spectrum. And it's a taste thing. I used to miss salt when I first gave it up, but now I don't add any salt to any of my food. And if I go out to eat, I immediately actually feel like the food is not tasty because it's too salty if it has too much salt. So it takes about probably 2 weeks or so, I would say, Wendy, don't you agree, for your body to sort of get used to having less salt? And Stephanie, you got to work on that.
Yes. It's a salt restriction is challenging, but it's easy to do once you become knowledgeable and become educated. And do more fresh foods. I think that's the bottom line. The more fresh.
And if you do really crave that salt flavor, then potassium chloride actually has the opposite effect of sodium chloride in your body. So potassium and sodium are kind of enemies in the kidney. And if you eat a lot of potassium, whether it's through potassium-rich foods like fruits and vegetables, or if you add potassium chloride, which is usually what the salt substitutes have, it actually helps your body excrete the sodium. So that's another way that you can reduce your sodium intake and still get that kind of flavor of salt in your food, is to use a salt substitute that has potassium chloride. But if you have any problems with your kidneys or anything like that, you want to be sure to check with your doctor before you use a potassium-based salt substitute.
You can also make an herb and spice blend. I have a recipe for it if you want to put it on the website.
If you want to send it to me, I'll put it on our blog.
Yeah, I've got one that works pretty well. And there's a spicy blend and a not so spicy blend. You can use light salt, is what we always call it. The potassium chloride is another good choice. But you can make your own herb and spice blend or get a Mrs. Dash type.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is I tried Mrs. Dash before. It's not the same. But I didn't give it 2 weeks, so maybe give my body the 2-week salt cleanse, and then we'll go from there. Now's a good time.
The problem with eating is if our life gets crazy or our life gets stressful, we tend to have that go by the wayside, and that's the last thing we should do.
Yeah, and it is stressful right now, but hopefully, you know, we're kind of getting to a new groove of a new normal, and people can hopefully be a little bit more mindful about the choices they're making. I had one last question, Dr. Coley. I wanted you to just talk a little bit more about the assessment we have for nutrition, then I'll let you guys go. Someone did say on the comments they're a personal trainer. They did the assessment and answered yes to all of them, so good for them. They know the right things to do. I think we all know the right things we should be doing, but maybe just talk about why someone would want to take our assessment and why it's important.
So I think the assessment, like I said before, the most important step towards correcting behavior is to be aware of it. The assessment really helps you to recognize if you think you eat healthy. You know, for example, I took it and I got a couple of no's on there, and I was a little surprised to see that. But you think you're living a good, healthy lifestyle, you know the facts, and there are things, behaviors that you might be doing that you might not realize. So I think the assessment really does bring to light subtle things that could be occurring, that could be chipping away at your, you know, at your nutrition or your health that you don't realize. So it's easy. It takes under 5 minutes to do. You can do it right from home. And if it is positive, you have 3 or more no's on there, then, you know, it's a really nice wake up call for you to really either get more educated, reach out to a dietitian, talk to your primary care provider, find ways in which you can make small changes that are going to have a huge impact on your health and how you feel.
Yeah, and just a good way to, a good easy way to check in on ourselves. I posted the link again in the comments, and I'll post the link to the landing page as well, because we also have assessments for your heart health, which we've talked about, diabetes, ask a medical question. I'm trying to think of all of them right now, but there's sleep apnea we just talked about. So there's several screenings that you can take for free online at 9healthcare.org and just get like a baseline assessment of yourself right now, and then take that to your primary care provider, either a virtual visit or go see your doctor to talk about things further. I want to remind everyone as well, if you have a health question, you can call our 9Health Neighbors line at 303-698-4455, extension 2005. Without the spring fairs, we started this 9Health Neighbors line with our medical volunteers, so people can still ask those health questions that they may normally go to a 9Health fair and ask. So that is still up and running. You can give them a call. They'll give you a call back within 24 hours. It's a real person you can talk to. So that is great. I want to thank both these ladies for joining me, and we're going to sign off from here. If you have additional questions, you can put those in the comments and I'll get them answered. But I want to thank you both for joining me.
Thanks.
All right. It is stopped. I had to mute you for a second, Wendy. Sorry, it was cutting in and out when Dr. Coley was talking, and I can't unmute you. I just realized. So.
Oh, no.
I had to mute you, and then you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, you're still muted, Wendy.
And I probably just messed her up. There's.
We can't hear you, Wendy.
You're still muted, Wendy. I'm sorry. I can't unmute you.